for the first time? A lot of you as well. Great. Well, let me tell you a little bit about what we've got in store for you this evening. So these talks that we do as part of Lates also happen during the day. If you visit the museum on Fridays, Saturdays or Sundays, you can come into the studio and experience one of our Nature Live talks. And these talks are put on as an opportunity for you to find out a bit more about what goes on behind the scenes at the museum. We have over 300 scientists that work with our collections here. But the collections don't just gather dust in the cupboards. They're actually used by teams of researchers, and many more come from all over the world to use that collection in their research and to further our understanding of the natural world. But today, we've got a special treat for you. We haven't got two museum scientists in the studio today. We've got a couple of external visitors who've come along. We've got two Nicks today. So on my right here, we've got Nick number 1. This is Nick Lyons. He comes from the BBC. And you may have seen his work recently on the Dynasties TV series. How many of you saw the Painted Wolves episode of Dynasties? Mm-hmm. Okay, a few people. We're going to spoil it a little today if you haven't seen it. But once you've heard the talk, go home, watch it. It's awesome. So thank you very much, Nick, for coming. Nick number 2 on the end there, we've got is Nick Dyer. Nick is a wildlife photographer, and he's been out in Africa photographing these wonderful animals as well. And in fact, you're both good friends, aren't you? You actually work quite closely together. So we'll find out a little bit about what you've been up to. But Nick's had some great success photographing these wonderful animals, and we'll be showing lots and lots of images today to really showcase what these creatures can do. It's very relaxed and informal, so if you've got any questions at all, pop your hand up. I've got a whole list that I want to ask, but I don't think I'm going to get through all of mine. We'll try and get through as many of yours as well as we can, but obviously time is limited. But if you do have questions, we'll do our best to get through as many as we can. All right. Well, with that out of the way, let's find out a little bit about yourselves. So, Nick Lyons, I said you're from the BBC, wildlife filmmaker. Can you just sort of tell us a little bit about kind of your background, how you got into this, and what's got you to where you are now?
Well, I always wanted to be a wildlife filmmaker, but when I finished university, I was told I was inexperienced. So they kept on knocking me back for jobs. So I packed my bag and moved out to Indonesia, set up a film company, and I think I made about 20 films out there. So
20 films?
Yeah, to begin with, mostly Indonesian language stuff, human rights, animal justice, doing a lot of undercover stuff on the palm oil situation. And then I got a natural world for the BBC on gibbons, and I did a 6-part series on the animals out there before I returned and came to the BBC, and they said, "Okay, we'll take you now."
You got to get that experience. You know, I know that feeling. A lot of places like that. Yeah, we'll hire you once you've done the job somewhere else. Yeah, excellent. And Nick, you're a photographer. Is that something you've always been passionate about? Always
been passionate about photography, but originally I was a fund manager in the City of London, and then and then I ran a marketing company, and then I decided I don't want to be behind a desk any longer. So in 2012, I moved out to Africa. I was brought up in Kenya. And I just followed my passion and my dreams, and the rest is history. So it's it got in that way, and it's been 6 years following these guys to finally produce a book.
Yeah, Painted Wolves, wonderful animals. I have to say, I'll say this now. I've got a very big soft spot for these animals because although I have yet to go to Africa to actually sort of be with them. But I remember when I was at school and I was thinking about what I wanted to study and do with my life, and I went along to my local university, which was Aberdeen in Scotland, and they've got a big zoology department and museum there, and they were doing lectures to kind of sell the university, encourage, it was an open day, and I was curious to go along, and they did a lecture on African wild dogs or painted wolves, and I was sold right there. I was like, this is what I want to do, and the rest is history there. So yeah, I've got a big soft spot for these animals. Now you guys you know each other, you're quite good friends. How did that come about? How did your sort of paths cross?
Where did we first meet? Was it at a den?
In Manor at the den. Yeah. So we would go in, and the dens aren't usually visited in Manor pools, but obviously for the book and for the film. So we would just sit there and go, "Who are you?" And I had my camera with a big lens, and Nick had even a bigger lens, and then at the den there's often quite there we are at the den. So but the dogs aren't always out there; they're often sleeping. So then you just start chatting, and then from there, really, isn't it? You know?
Yeah. I think
was it was a bit of competition between you, like who can take the best photos and
N-
things?
no, I mean, taking film and taking photos is a very different thing. And also, when I first met Nick, he had so much respect for the animals, and that's quite, worked in this industry long enough to see there's good photographers and bad photographers, and he's one of the best because he really gets the animal and he gives it the right respect and distance, and it's friends quickly.
And also Nick has worked so much on other dogs, coyotes and Arctic foxes, and
Dole, wolves,
yeah, exactly. So I mean, I learnt a lot more about the painted wolves from Nick as well, and comparing different behaviours and so on and so forth. So we had a lot in common. It was never really competition. I also learnt how to touch his video without breaking it.
Do you learn that the hard way? So we've got loads of pictures you probably saw there. I'll try and get through as many as I can during the show because they're really wonderful pictures and showcasing a whole variety of different behaviours. So Nick, why the TV series Dynasties, which aired recently, there was 5 episodes, each focusing on a different animal, and unlike some of the other series that have been out in recent years, which had these kind of huge, epic scopes, things like Planet Earth, Blue Planet, really like encompassing a whole ecosystem. This series seems to be all about really honing in on the individuals and telling their stories. Why were Painted Wolves selected? Because you've only got 5 episodes, and you've got to make sure it's worth it. So why were Painted Wolves picked as one of the candidates for the series?
Well, they were a hard sell because supposedly they split the audience. They've got a reputation that they don't deserve, and that has kind of put people off them for a very long time. But we have covered them in Planet Earth, in Life Story, but we never managed to get under the skin. We always were doing the hunt, which is, that is the grisly bit. But actually, there's so much more to them. And Dynasties was all about trying to find something that was all about the family, and there's no animal I've worked with that rely more on each other than these. It's the perfect example of a good family behavior, and especially given the fact that we were looking for a change. Then, as we were surveying all the different areas, then Marna Pools was ready for a change, and so we came in at the perfect time to cover that.
So you mentioned Marna Pools there. That's the name of the region where the episode took place.
Yes, it's a national park and a UNESCO World Heritage Site on the northern border of Zimbabwe. It's on the Zambezi River, so it's a very beautiful spot.
The one thing I noticed in the episode that I really liked was it was one of the few episodes that had a kind of CG map that kind of outlined, and it marked out the territories of the different individuals that we'll talk about in a minute. And I quite liked that because quite often you don't usually see that in these kind of documentaries, and it's nice to kind of orientate and figure out, okay, this is where we are.
Well, I mean, it's quite a big story, and I knew that we weren't going to hit the maps very often, but what I wanted to get a very plain and simple orientation for the audience so they could follow what they're doing when they're going left to right and when they're going right to left. So they just had an idea of where the lions were, where the hyenas were, and where Tate and Blacktip were.
It was just like Lion King. It was great. Yeah, it was really good. So Nick, were you out there doing your photography already before Nick and the BBC came along?
Yeah. So when I started, I was just driving all over that map basically for about 2 years, just learning about all the different parks, and then I discovered Marna Pools. And the great thing about Marna Pools is that it's the only park in Africa that you're allowed to walk by yourself on foot. And so after a few close shaves and learning and listening from guides about how not to die, it's just an amazing and a totally different experience to actually be walking with these guys. And I met the dogs. A guide came and said, "Come and walk with me," and we followed them on the hunt. And then I was just hooked. So I think I've spent about in the last 6 years, about 380 days in the park in total. So it is a very, very special place.
Wonderful region. It must feel like that kind of classic, when we think about the wild and all these animals living together and interacting together, this is where it happens and you really see it.
I mean, to me, it's a kind of Eden, isn't it? Because you're actually walking around.
And particularly working with that species, because they interact with more animals than anyone else in Marna Pools, aren't they? There's always something happening. And even when I went back just recently, I think I've done 669 days filming, and I took the press back for 2 days. And in those 2 days, I saw stuff I hadn't seen in that whole time, different animal interactions, they're constantly surprising.
Absolutely.
A wonderful region. I'd love to go there at some point and do a bit of photography myself. I think it'd be really nice. Now, one of the things that when you watch the documentary and you see these photographs is, it seems that you guys can get really close to these animals. How did you win their trust over? They seem to tolerate you, kind of watching their every move. Did that take a long time, or were they quite trusting? How did that happen?
It's a combination. So the guide that I was working with, Nick, had known them for about 20 years. So
It's another Nick.
Another Nick,
Nicks,
yeah.
yep.
So he knew Tate from when she first left the den. He knew Tate's mother, and he knew Tate's grandmother. So he was very much, and Tate lived right next to his camp. So, well, she did before we arrived, when we were taken to see him, it was basically friend of my friend. So they trust Nick implicitly, so they were trusting us. But then Nick set certain rules about our behaviour, and he said, this is the operating distance. This is all we're allowed to do. And as time went on, I was like, well, this is the 20th species of canid that I've worked with, and I'm pretty certain that I can get closer to them because I'm reading their body language and they're being incredibly relaxed. And so we just slowly worked closer and closer over the months. And it was, principally because we didn't necessarily need to get that close with some of the images, but what I knew was Monopool's stuff happens all the time. The lions attack, the hyenas attack. So the last thing you want to do when you're filming is to have any impact on the animal you're filming. So we had to get the trust to the point that when the lions would rush them, they weren't looking at us and their ears weren't at us. They'd be totally focused on the animal they're interacting.
Forgetting you're just part of the landscape.
You're just,
now.
they're just oblivious to you because you spent so long with them and you're literally no threat to them. But it's also important to point out that we're not habituating them to people because they, like any dog, they recognize individuals. They knew Nick, they knew me, they knew my core camera team, and they knew our guides. But if another car would come anywhere close, they'd just move off.
Yeah.
They would.
I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, the other thing is what Nick says, is that you just have to be so sensitive and understand the animal and understand the behavior of the painted wolves. And they will tell you. So sometimes we would walk into the den and they'll start barking at us and, just giving that gruff, and we would leave because they're telling us that day that they don't want us around. And it's being very sensitive to them. They could have been up all night fighting off hyena or things like that. So being sensitive to the animal and respectful to it is really key to good photography.
But we ended up driving in with our massive Land Rover because it was such a banger that it made such a horrible sound that they'd got used to that horrible sound. So anyone in a cruiser, they'd be worried, but they always recognise the BBC vehicle because it was the cheapest, oldest,
the cheap one that's falling apart.
But they loved it. Because they knew exactly who was in it, so we could tootle up to the den, and before they could see us, they could hear us, and they knew it was us. So
is it this one?
No, although David did get his butt cooked by that one because I don't know if you know, the battery is under the passenger seat, and he was bouncing along as Nick was driving, and he said, "Oh, it's very hot in this seat, Nick." He said, "It's a Land Rover; it's supposed to be hot." And what had happened was the plate had crossed the terminals, and suddenly he said, "Can we please stop?" He stood off, and then a big thing of smoke came out from under his bum.
Really?
Oh my God!
The battery was melted; it was boiling.
You say, "David, you've melted the battery, mate. What are you doing?" Oh, fantastic!
One of the great vehicles.
Well, it's good to see we're using these things as much as possible. We don't need to get new stuff. We'll reuse what we've got. Wonderful landscape, and it must have felt like a real privilege to get so close to these animals, and for them to trust you to the extent you can just watch them do what it is that they do. Must have been an incredible feeling.
No, I mean, every time I went up to the dogs, I would always talk to them and say, "Hi, dogs, how are you doing this morning?" Because you don't want to surprise them, and they go, "Who are you?" So I'm always talking, and then I fire off a load of shots with my camera, and they go, "Oh, you." And sometimes you get a little bark, and then they'll just calm down and sit down. It was really lovely. Yeah.
You said fire off shots there, and for a minute I thought you had a gun. I was like, "Whoa, what's going on?" Excellent. Well, one of the reasons we wanted to talk about painted wolves, particularly this evening, was the theme for tonight's Lates is intelligence, and we're looking at different animals and how we perceive what looks like it could be intelligence. Now, in the film and in the photographs, we can see what looks like a whole array of different behaviors, different interactions, and these dogs are very much pack animals. They seem to do everything together. What was, could you guys maybe talk us through some of the interesting behaviours that you saw, and do you think, do these strike you as intelligent predators?
No. I think to me the strength is in the pack. They're led by an alpha female, and so Tate and Blacktip and Tammy, who were in the film, and they're the same packs that we were following. And I think they actually act as a pack, and each of the dogs almost has its own speciality. So some are incredibly good at hunting. There was Triss, who, whenever a dog got wounded, she would act as the doctor. We nicknamed her Doc, and she would come in and lick the dogs that were actually had any wounds. There was Pip, or I used to call her Taco. The BBC said because she had the collar, and all they could hear was Pip, Pip, Pip. So she got called Pip. And but she was the chief babysitter, and she would play with the pups all the time.
Even when they were growing up.
Even when they were growing up. I mean, she just loved the little pups and playing. She was a kid herself.
I'm going to bring up the obligatory pup picture.
Yeah.
There we go.
We were stood next to each other. We got the same shot.
That's in the film as well. Yeah, no, absolutely. I saw that and I thought, But so intelligent? Would you say they're intelligent?
I mean, as I say, I've worked with about 20 canids, and when I came to the Painted Wolves, I was thinking this is going to be so easy. I'm going to understand them immediately. And I got there, and I was like, I don't understand what these guys are thinking. And I thought, are they even thinking anything? So they're quite different from most of the canids I've worked with. And at first I thought they were a bit dumb, but you start to kind of get a feel. But it turns out that there's really smart ones and there's some pretty dumb ones.
So just like people. Yeah.
So Tate and Blacktip were both very, very smart dogs. Really, they were strategizers. They commanded a lot of respect. When Tammy took over, it was a bit by default because she got pregnant in an unusual situation, and she shouldn't really have stood up to be alpha. She was the youngest of the pack, and it's kind of borne out by the fact that she hasn't yet raised a puppy to adulthood, and I don't think she's the smartest.
No, there's one puppy out there which the tracker, the painted dog conservation tracker, called Atten, because Atten was there when Tammy was pregnant.
Yeah,
and so and I left her in November, and she had 5 pups this year, and there's only one left, and she hasn't.
And that's the third litter.
That's the third litter. So whereas Blacktip just 10 a year, no problems at all. So there is there are some packs and some animals are far more intelligent than others. And I've seen, like with Tate, and I've seen her in a hyena attack. There might be a picture there of a big hyena attack. That one there, yeah. So that with the collar on there is Tate, and she often didn't get involved in the fight. It was almost as if she was looking at the next hyena coming in and making sure that the pups were covered and the other dogs were fighting off the hyenas. So I always thought, there are some where you actually say, gosh, she's incredible. I mean, she's a general, as well as caring mother and leader and decider of where to go and hunt and eat and what direction to go. So they are, you see different levels of intelligence in the different packs.
And even when she was on her very last legs, she could hardly move anymore for arthritis. She was limping. There was not a question of her leadership.
No,
they all followed her to the end.
I think that's the thing that really struck me when I was watching it, and one thing I'm very conscious of is I guess it's very easy for us to anthropomorphize, and we see things happening and then kind of imprint, well, this must be what she's thinking. And I guess actually when you're building the episode, that must be something you have to be really conscious of. Is, obviously you want to tell a story, but it's got to be what's actually happening, not what you think is happening.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that the whole thing of anthropomorphizing is a bit of an outdated concept. It was when there was a strong human-animal divide, and I think all of us now recognize that we're animals, and there's gradations of everything. We didn't evolve emotions. Emotions came from the animal kingdom. And anyone who owns a dog knows that their dog has emotions. anyone who has a cat knows their cat has emotions. It isn't anthropomorphic. And as soon as you kind of free yourself from that tether and don't try and see them as humans, but try and see what they're actually doing and what their responses mean, then yeah, you can see a whole load of emotions and thought processes that were previously not even considered because people like to keep humans separate. But
yeah, that idea.
That boundary's got. I'm an
advanced.
anthropologist by background, so that's
It's something you certainly.
that's
know
something
about.
I've looked into academically deeply, and yeah.
So for those, I know not everybody's seen the episode yet, and you've already mentioned a couple of the individuals that were kind of key characters in this story. Could you summarise sort of briefly what was shared in that episode? Because it really was focusing on these kind of two dogs that you've said were incredibly intelligent animals, Tate and Blacktip.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sad kind of encapsulating story. I mean, I don't know if anyone who watched it really picked up on it, but normally when a daughter leaves her mother, they'll expand outwards. And in the world today, there's very few places to expand outwards. So whilst Mana Pools is a great haven for these animals, it is a contained space and there's limited resources. So instead of Blacktip moving away, she was stuck next to her mother and her pack grew huge. When we arrived, it was 30. It's rare to see that. Back in the old days, you could get them up to 60, couldn't you? We've heard rumours of packs of 60. But 30 is huge for today. In Wangi, they
30,
don't.
30 was the biggest I saw in Mana Pools. That was Blacktip in 2015.
In Wangi, doesn't get over 7, really, does it?
No, often 9 or
so.
It's very few.
In one pack, you've got 5 packs worth compared to other places. So that pressure was huge, and so she just had to turn against her mother.
Actually, I just while you're talking about that, if I bring up this image, this is kind of showing the territories that these dogs occupy. And now, at one point, am I right in saying that most of East Africa would have
most of Southern Africa
or Southern Africa?
Yeah,
but now they're sort of in these fractured areas. So that obviously has had an effect.
And it's far more fractured than that map shows as well. I mean that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So it was this kind of lack of space. The Blacktip's pack was getting too big, and it kind of was inevitable that she was pushed into her mum's territory.
Yeah, I mean it's the prime hunting spot in Mana Pools there. So, and she knew it because she'd grown up in there, and so she was making a choice that was the best for her puppies. Which sadly was not great for Tate.
Wasn't the case. There were a few moments that really stick with people in the episode. Those puppies and the whole pack went through a bit of a trial in this kind of invasion of Tate's territory. Can you tell us about a couple of the sort of the events that happened in that?
Well, sadly, that's when Blacktip pushed too far because she already held Tate's core territory. Tate had moved out into what we call the Lion Pride lands, and she of all the dogs that were still alive, she's the only one who actually carved a living out there early. And her first ever litter she had in the Pride lands, and she lost all of them. Then she moved about 25 kilometers down the river and set up in this location that she had litter after litter after litter in the same den, the same den, the same den. So she basically solved her problem. She got pushed back into that place. But at least she had grown up knowing it. Blacktip had taken over her territory, and then at some point she just caught wind on the border of her mum, and it was bizarre. She just went in pursuit, and by doing that, then she did expose herself to stuff that she was not prepared to deal with.
So there were, we did see you were able to catch on film hyenas attacking. We've seen some images there. There was lion attacks as well. I mean, it is the stuff of almost like a kind of classic African tale. These animals encountering their mortal enemies on the out there in nature. In
the lion attack, it was the most surreal thing I've ever seen because they were just about to take the puppies, and then that buffalo ran straight into the middle. And we were all gobsmacked as the lions jumped the buffalo and pulled it down. And that was under the tree that Blacktip's pack was sleeping. Yeah. And that was her very first day in the Pride lands.
What a first day, goodness me. And that scene, when it played out, one of the things that sort of struck me was because you weren't expecting it, and you've just said that. How do you kind of maintain your composure? And because you're there to do a job, you're there to film, and something happens, and you're like, you're kind of dumbfounded almost, but you still manage to get those great shots. It must take quite a discipline.
It's interesting. In the moment, it's normally fine, but if you get a really good shot, so on the floodplain, you get this long view, and sometimes you'll get them coming towards you, and you can pull focus, and they'll track past. You have to step over the tripod legs twice to get round, because you get a full 180-degree sweep, and then you're happy, and then you stop moving, and then suddenly you feel the camera going doo-doom, 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 and that's your heartbeat after. So you get the shot, but afterwards you have to really quickly calm yourself down, because with that lens, it's 1500 millimeters. It's a massive amplifier of any movement. It's an optical lever, so you just hands off it and calm yourself, and then go in for the next shot.
You must be so excited. You think, that's the shot. That's going in. Like that's.
Well, sometimes excited, but I've cried, I've vomited making this film. It's pretty horrific when you're there with animals that you care about deeply, and you see what's happening to them. It's they go through it.
Well, yeah, there was the point in the episode when there's the crocodile attack. I think that affected you quite significantly, didn't it?
Yeah,
it certainly completely shocked me when it happened, because it was all calm, all quiet, and then suddenly it leaps out, and of course one of the pups.
Well, we were still kind of slightly reeling from a lion encounter, and they were just thinking about lions. So normally when they come down to the water, they're very, very cautious of crocodiles, and they'll look, and they sometimes spend half an hour just staring at the water before they even dare to drink. On this occasion, because they had the lions in the back of their mind, they just ran down. They'd had a real shock, and that crocodile just came out of nowhere. And whilst the crocodile attack itself was horrific, what really got me was the pack's reaction. They were just so...
I was just about to say that, because it looked... you could... And again, am I reading into this? But it looked like they wanted to help and couldn't.
Oh, they did. I mean, Blacktip and Hornet were both in the water. And that's Mum and Dad. They both were in there, and that place is full of crocodiles.
Yeah.
They were really putting themselves at risk.
And then, again, anyone that has a dog, as you were saying earlier, they obviously experience emotions and can emote in quite an obvious way. And you could see in the footage the tails kind of dropped low, their heads down.
After the hyena encounter, no one had ever seen that before.
They kind of look, it almost looked like they were sort of sad and mourning.
Yeah. And also their reaction. I mean, they ran 25 kilometers. That's not normal, not with little puppies. They covered pretty much half the distance of the park as a reaction to that event.
And they display so much coordination in their hunting, because I wanted to ask a little bit about this, because they appear to be so coordinated in taking down their prey, because of course the tricky thing when you're a predator is when you spend that energy, you want to get a meal at the end of it to replenish it, and that must require a certain degree of intelligence. And of course then when you get an event like that where there's an attack and one's gone, the animals feel that more. So did you witness any of this sort of hunting that sort of really impressed you in terms of like how they're able to coordinate and bring down their prey?
We certainly witnessed a lot of impressive hunting, but I've been berating my colleagues who have worked with these animals before, because if you listen to their commentaries, then you think they were making these big pincer movement plans. And did you ever see a coordinated hunt?
No. I mean, so my what I would do in the morning is follow them on the hunt on foot, and I was lucky my camera's lighter than yours. But you would actually be walking with them, and they would be running, and you would be trying to catch up. They fortunately stopped for a rest, and then they would. I mean, there's one picture there which I think you showed before of them where they get quite close to the impalas. So that one.
Is that one?
That one there, yeah. And then they're off, and it suddenly just becomes absolute mayhem. So it's almost like every dog for itself. Or there's that Julius Caesar quote, which is sort of like, "Cry havoc, let slip the dogs of war," and they're literally just right out into the in there, and trying
they
to
were
see
zipping back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, I've had them brush past my leg, or suddenly think that impala's getting big as it's charging towards me. And
sometimes they look for cover, the impalas.
Exactly,
it's like, maybe they'll take that one.
Yeah, no, that's it. And I mean, and again, I mean, the adrenaline you're feeling during this, and it's actually quite quiet as well. They're not. You just hear
until they run either side of you.
Yeah, exactly.
I've literally been standing there with the camera and thinking I can't focus anymore. So I know it's less than 5 meters, and I stood up, and I've had 30 dogs go either side of me, and it sounds like horses then. But there's never a worry.
Oh, I was just going to say, were you ever worried?
Not from them.
No. Because looking at something like the impala, you talk about how you gained their trust and they weren't afraid of you, but equally, they're not afraid of the impala either. They're not, but they go after them for food.
Yeah.
here you are lying there with a giant camera. I mean, if I were a dog, I'd be like,
Well,
that's easy prey.
it is interesting because when we started the film, they were purely impala specialists. Like there's different, you just have to go to Wangi and they might take down an eland, which is a 900 kilo antelope. There's a big creature. Impala are pretty small, but just them focusing on impala made you think, well, we're not impala. But then I think it was, what was it, about 5 months into filming, they suddenly started taking baboons.
Yeah.
Now, baboons. So these animals. So painted wolf's about 25 kilos, and a big male baboon can reach 40 kilos. They're certainly stronger than me and Nick.
No, absolutely. Yeah, you wouldn't want to take them on, and they are. Yeah, I mean that's pretty horrendous.
Yeah, and then you see them taking the baboons and say, okay, well they're on primates now.
You're like, I mean, we're next. Yeah.
But no, again, they just they never. I think there's no coincidence that that we domesticated canids. There's some sort of bond I've felt with every canid I've ever worked with.
Yeah.
You can stick up a hide, and then you've got a desert fox that appears between your legs because it knows you're in the hide and it's come to see you. So.
Yes. The other fascinating thing about the baboon hunting was that the actual manipouls, the baboons were becoming a problem because they had no natural predators, and there was just more and more, and then they would eat the eggs of the guinea fowl, and then there's less guinea fowl, so there's that's affecting the termites, which is affecting the grass. There's more termites, less grass. And so the dogs actually started to do the ecosystem a favor. That it's funny how in nature that these things suddenly come into balance. And nowhere in Africa has it ever been recorded that painted wolves will attack primates.
In fact, we got so many records. I think we filmed 90 different encounters that it was enough for the basis of a scientific paper. So people always think about leopards as baboon hunters, but statistically they avoid them. They will much rather an impala or anything apart from a baboon. If they're forced to, they'll take a baboon. But based on the number of baboon there, they can say they're actively avoiding them. This is the first time that anything has been seen to actively hunt a baboon.
Absolutely, yeah. The other funny thing is that we have a good friend, one of the guides, Henry Bandura. He's a phenomenal guide. But his theory was that because the baboons would run down the tree when they saw the dogs coming, and Henry's theory was that when the baboons scream the warning sound, they shout leopard because they haven't learnt the word for dog. So they all run down thinking the leopard's going to come up the tree.
No, it's the worst thing to get to come down to the ground.
But it's true because they did have a word for dog, but they shared it with lion, and it's like it's predator, but not really a threat. And as soon as they became a threat, then they had to change, and so the only predator that was a real threat was leopard. And they shout leopard, and even in night time, we've got footage of all these baboons piling out of their roosts because they don't want to be caught up there by the leopard, and the dogs are just waiting for them.
And very sadly, the baboons did eventually, and that's is it
Patrick?
That's Patrick, yeah. So the baboons, they would come back with these horrendous bites.
So that's caused by the canines of the baboon. So you think impala or baboon? Well, the impala's not going to do that to you.
Yes and no. I mean, that's the other thing is. In the dry season, they were hunting baboon. Comes back to the wet season, they went back to impala mostly. So they were picking up so many injuries hunting impala because there's so many elephants there, and it's next to the river, so there's low wet patches that you have this lunar landscape that gets baked in. If you're trying to get across those elephant footprints on foot or even by car, it's rattling apart. And so you see them running, and they don't look down. They have to keep their eye on the prize. And so when we were filming Wicket, and she broke a leg, and her bone had popped out. And that's a far greater threat to them for their hunting than these cuts, because they are very tough animals. In fact, Wicket recovered within 10 days from that leg break.
Incredible recovery time.
Yeah. And also those those impala do have rather sharp headgear. So you try and dive at one with the horns. I mean, it's quite
you could
tried
take
no.
Not speaking from experience. All right, I'm just going to take a pause there for a minute because I'm sure we've probably got some questions from the audience. So pop your hand up if you have a question. Anyone want to ask a question? Yes, we've got one around here.
I just wanted to ask about the process of building like a larger story out of all those hundreds of hours of footage and how you choose. I don't know what your involved is in that, or how you choose what you're picking, or when you know when think, oh, this is definitely a Moses game, or how you pare it down from all those years of footage.
Yeah.
Really
That's a good question.
I mean, this film was a very different experience for me because normally, if we're doing these blue chip landmark series like Planet Earth, you say, okay, I am going to tell a story about deserts, and I'm going to get 10 sequences, and I'm going to go out and capture a specific behavior that can give me some sort of story that relates to the environment. And so, you know, the best time of year to go, the best group to film a specific behavior, and you know what the behavior is, and you know what your shots are that you need to tell that story. With this, we had a kind of 4-year window, and we were going to say, what is the story of these animals? And so it's really tough because we started with 3 packs, and over time we filmed 91 animals. So we had to learn all the 91 animals in 3 packs, and we had to backstory all of them because we never knew who was going to be the important one at the end. So as we were going, we were trying to see where the interesting politics were. We managed to drop Janet's pack pretty early because she was separated from Tate by the Pride Lands, so they weren't really engaging. Although she did manage to rescue one of Tate's puppies that got separated, and she adopted that. So you slowly start to sieve it down, and then we were just saying, okay, this sequence would make it into Planet Earth, and so let's put that on the board. And by the end of the film, I had 90 of those on the board. And it's like, well, this is too, this is too big.
Much.
So you take a big step back and say, what was the big overarching story in the battle between Tate and Blacktip? And you try and put that in, and then through that you find illustrative sequences that allow you to travel through the main story arc, whilst you're also showing a bit of the zoology, a bit of the interaction and behaviour. But it was tough, and it was the longest edit I've ever done. We normally get given 16 weeks, and I think I was in about 36 weeks. Because it's an observational documentary. It's not a classic natural history.
Yes, that's a good question. I've wondered that myself, actually. God, it must take forever to put these together. Yes, at the front here. What are the role of the males in the pack?
Well, I would only speak for minor pools because they're so different from place to place. But for the males that we were working with, in Tammy's pack, they seem to lead baboon hunting. Like Patrick was a big baboon hunter. In Blacktip's pack, they were bodyguards. So Hornet and Jenna and Amos and Gianni, they would, after the year where they lost those puppies to the hyenas in the night, they just became guard dogs, didn't they? And they would race the hyena if they saw them at 200 meters.
Yeah.
And so they played a very important role, but they weren't really the decision makers. They were kind of the muscle. Oh no, they're central.
Yeah. I mean, the pack stays there. So I mean, the other thing is that all of them play with the pups, and that's the other thing, is that they're not like, you know, I think that's, you know, with that alpha female leading the pack, they compete with submission. They look after the sick. You know, they are they're far more, in many ways, they're looking after each other. So they play a lot of homogenous roles as well. But leading the hunts and you know, they are a bit stronger. But there's not a dominance. You know, the males are.
No.
And there's usually only just one alpha male as well. In fact, there is only one alpha male who will mate with the female. So, and all the others have less dominant roles.
Again, it varies so much, but what I would say for something that has an alpha couple, it is the least hierarchical animal I've ever worked with. It's very egalitarian, and it's puppies first, feed the weak.
Yep.
I mean, Tate didn't hunt maybe for the last 4 months of her life.
No, she was always fed.
She was always being fed.
Patrick, I mean, you saw the picture with the dog there. He came. I was sitting in the riverbed. He came back after a hunt, and the other side of him, I mean, half of his side was hanging out, and I thought, there's no chance. You know, we're really, really very worried about him, and and he just rested. He was put off. He was let off hunting duty for about 4 or 5 days, and I thought he was dying, and then he was out hunting within a week.
Yeah.
I mean, incredibly strong animals.
Which is different from some things.
Incredible.
Yeah.
You're talking about less than a week and things.
Yeah. I mean, really incredible.
I mean, I'd seen something similar. I was filming Indian desert wolves, and a wolf got caught in a snare and lost its forelimb, and I thought it was going to have a tough time, but they put it on babysitting duty, so it was left back at the den. But the second denning season was over, they booted it out.
Really?
And that would never happen with a painted wolf.
No.
I mean, it was brutal.
Really?
You've done your job. Get out.
Looking looking out for each other. Any other questions? Yes, the back row.
Given all of the energy and the passion that you have for these animals, did you feel like the final product did your experience justice?
I would hope so, because I was in charge of it. It's always tough to make it, make 4 years of your life into an hour. But I think the way people responded to it was positive.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I'm not biased, but when I watched the series, and this was well before we'd planned to do a talk with you, I watched all 5 episodes and I said the Painted Wolf one was my favourite. Definitely, it was. I really, really liked it. Any other questions? Yes.
You talk
No,
about
it's
it.
yeah. I mean, it's so back in 1914, so 100 years ago, there were 500,000 painted wolves. Today, there's 6,500 left in the wild. In 1914, the government of Rhodesia introduced a 5-shilling bounty for every tail you brought into the magistrates. So as the Europeans brought in their farming practices into Africa, they were basically considered vermin because an over-exaggerated threat to cattle and livestock. And so I think I think in the 40s or 50s you could go into Kruger National Park. It was the only animal you were allowed to shoot. And the bounty went up to 20 shillings by 1978, and that was when it actually stopped. So the whole, I mean, this was just treated as vermin. And now the threats are back to, they're being snared, not intentionally by villagers, but they're still actually a huge threat. And farmers still try and kill them today, although they are they're a protected species. But you might want to think of what we're doing in the UK to badgers when you think about what we're now trying to do with everything we can to try and save this species.
Yeah.
But that's also another thing. I mean, we spoke a lot about this at the Den, was that they've been called wild dogs. And when I say I'm running around photographing and filming wild dogs, people think I've found some stray mutts from Harare and I'm charging after them with a camera. And the name Painted Wolves, which is a literal translation of their scientific name, Lycaon pictus, is kind of more kind to the species and more interesting, rather than a wild dog, which is pretty derogatory for the poor creature.
That's an
Although
interesting
we
point,
get a lot
actually,
of
'cause
flack for that.
when I was mentioning earlier, when I first heard about them, everyone was referring to them as African wild dogs. And then when I started hearing Painted Wolf, it's almost like a rebranding. You know, that
But it's happened a number of
it
times.
sounds a lot nicer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
When David first worked with them, they're called Cape Hunting dogs. So when he was hearing the fuss about the name change, he said, "Oh, don't be ridiculous! It's been changing ever since I was a child."
It really is brand
They've
changing.
got about
It's just
8
that-
common names
They've got about
in
eight-
English.
eight, and we're just talking about the English names as
Yeah.
well. So not it's nothing to get too worked up about. But that's I think Painted Wolves really does suit them, and but we do get a bit of flack about that.
But even people who know them, I've got a friend who's made a film about them, and he was critical of the change of name. And then he watched the film. He said, "Really interesting watching the film and hearing them called Painted Wolves. I saw them in a way I'd never seen them, and I've followed them in the wild." He said, "They make more sense to me now."
yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Now, that was an interesting point about the bad reputation, actually. And I know, Nick, you're very passionate about the conservation of these animals. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that side of your work that you've been working on?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So basically, I set up after doing the book, and we set up something called the Painted Wolf Foundation. There's a lot in Africa. There's a lot of amazing organisations that are involved in local areas with the conservation. A lot to do with tracking them and understanding them better, but also anti-poaching and working with communities and education. All these things are really the future for trying to keep these animals with us, because I mean they do hunt. If you had a farm with a load of sheep and you had one of these a pack denning, you're gonna suffer. So the communities that actually live with these animals have to see value in them. So we've set up the Painted Wolf Foundation because one of the key roles is to actually raise awareness of the species, because most people, I mean, you know, most people have never heard of them. And I mean, the BBC has just done a phenomenal job in actually getting them onto the radar. But, you know, we've got over, 450,000 elephant, 25,000 rhinos, 6,500 of these guys. And what we really want to do, with everyone's support if possible, is trying to get them onto the top table of conservation, because that's really where we believe that they belong. Because I think in the race to extinction, they are leading it, and it's a race they never wanted to be in. Yeah, trying to get these, people recognizing just how endangered they are, and how wonderful they are, because they are really very, very special creatures.
They're also the first to disappear, aren't they? I mean, just because their ranging habits, they're the kind of canary in the coal mine. If they disappear, then you know something's going wrong in that habitat.
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you've certainly done, the BBC show, and talking about it like this is, this is how you raise that awareness, isn't it? And hopefully we'll be able to turn around, because the number, that 6,500 that's nothing,
But I mean, I think what the BBC film, what I've tried to do in my book, and is really just to say these are incredible animals. I mean, I think if you go on a safari in Africa and you see lions, they sleep all day. Yeah, I mean, they're incredibly dull. These sleep all day, but then they wake up and they have this amazing greeting ceremony where they jump up and down and they dance and they bite each other and chase each other. I mean, it's such fun to actually watch. They really are lovely.
Wonderful. Well, we've just got a couple of minutes left, but before we wrap up, I wanted to bring up one image in particular that you took, Nick, that if you've been to the Wildlife Photographer of the Year exhibition, you'll have seen this. Now, tell us about this, Nick, because this is one part, it's fascinating. It's quite grisly. I bet you absolutely love it. Tell us about this photo.
So these are two of Blacktip's pups. And they had actually just killed a baboon, and I was going down, just following them on the hunt. I missed the kill, but they were there, and they'd almost finished the baboon. There was only enough for the Blacktip had 9 pups. This was 216.
Yeah, 9 and 10. Yeah.
And anyway, so ripped up the thing, and then that chap at front who had this white chest, he just we never named them before they become yearlings. But anyway, just found this head and just thought it was so much fun. And so they were charging up and down, playing this amazing game of ball. It was quite gruesome. And then he would not relinquish it. And so so occasionally the other pups said, right, we're not going to play. And they would just sit in a little huddle. And he would get really annoyed. And he would actually walk up towards me with his head. Saying, do you want to join in? It's like, no, go away. And there's another picture. I call that whatever, and that's the set from the same sequence. And that one is called Whatever Happens, Keep Smiling.
Great picture. Yeah, it just shows I think you really summed up when you talked about how, the lions sleep all day, and these guys, they're just exhibiting so much behavior, which just makes them fascinating to watch.
But I think the important thing, and I'm sure both of us agree, they have fun.
Yeah.
Without a doubt, they are. They just love each other. They love being with each other. They love just whether that's adding human emotions to them, but you just sense and you just get this entire feeling of that they're just having so much fun as a family. And that's what's really lovely.
Excellent. Well, we're just about out of time, but before we go, I don't know what you're allowed to say, but Nick, any future projects you can talk about, or is that all top secret?
It is highly top secret.
I thought it might be.
The T-shirt might be a hint.
Okay, there we go. Excellent. So there's something to chew on. Nick, yourself, you got any projects coming up?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be taking a few people to try and meet these guys in Manor Pools and lead a few safaris. But but also really, really important to me is actually taking the work of the Painted Wall Foundation forward, doing talks, raising awareness, and trying to support those incredible organisations that are actually working out there and keeping these guys alive.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both very much for talking to us tonight. Thank you guys as well. If you want to find out a bit more, do watch the documentary if you haven't already. It is on iPlayer. I checked. I watched it again before the show, so check it out. I hope we've inspired you. But please join me now in thanking both of our Nicks for coming along and sharing their experiences with us. Thank you very much.